You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest is Jeffery Moore Williams. He's the founder of the Vitalist project. We're going to talk about your nervous system and how to reset it and what's called alpha-biotic alignment. So welcome, Jeff. Thanks for coming.
Man, it's great to be here.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background first, and then we'll talk about your current work.
Well, yeah, I've been in this field of helping others, especially through kind of holistic means for the last 25 years. Started just coming out of being just an athlete and a nature enthusiast, always spending as much time as I can outside, and just was noticing a lot of people around me all the time. And so got into kind of transitioning into helping people move with in a more quality way that really designed to help the human body. And then realized when people were having trouble moving that the hands-on work really was a way to help them get past whatever hurdles or obstacles they were facing in moving. And
what do you mean in moving? Like what does that mean?
Movement, like, I do a lot of movement work, meaning, could be from yoga to dance to qigong.
What problems? Like, do they have problems with basic movement, like sitting in a chair, getting up from a chair, laying down? When you say they have movement problems, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, also, pain. So like not being able to turn your neck all the way or having a hitch in your step, like hip problems. And so it led me down the path to body work and allowed me to get my hands on people and start to learn more about anatomy and physiology. And that ultimately led me to like the master system in the body, the brain and nervous system, and realizing that my approach these days is really how do I do the least to create the most impact. And turns out that that's really what I found is it means you have to work directly with the brain, because when I'm working down with muscles or bones, trying to get someone to open up their mobility or increase range of motion or have more comfort in their body and moving, and sometimes it's extreme as not being able to get up from a chair, but even just people who are typically high performance and then they run into walls or obstacles, symptoms that are holding them back. And so a lot of those people came through my door, and it was when I started to understand that the brain controls the nerves and nerves control the fascia and fascia control muscles and muscles move bones, that I could work down on the bones or I could work on the muscles or I could work on the fascia, but to get the biggest results that create the most change, it's really about working at the top of that chain at the brain.
What is that, the nerves?
It's the brain. Yeah, the brain into
the brain.
So yeah, if I can make a change, if I can reset, that brain body connection, then everything downline changes. So, something.
Well, what does that mean? Reset it. Like what does that mean?
Well, imagine just like your computer, if you leave your computer on and you never turn it off and you've got, lots of different programs and apps running on it, what happens is it becomes less and less efficient. You didn't realize you didn't finish that other thing you'd started the other day or the other week or the other month, and it's still sitting there in the background. So it's bogging the whole thing down. It's slowing it down, reducing efficiency. And so at some point you end up with that little wheel of rainbow that's spinning and spinning, and we all know what to do. We restart the computer, right? And you reset it.
Yeah.
So the brain works in a similar fashion. Turns out, so about 100 years ago, there was a chiropractor named Virgil Crane, and he was hired to audit all of the chiropractors west of the Mississippi in the early 1920s, that is. And after that, took him about 5 years, and he identified over 600 chiropractic adjustments, and he found that none of them lasted more than 90 to 100 steps from the table. So his hunch...
What do you mean 90 to 100 steps from the table? What happened?
So a chiropractor makes an adjustment at that bone level because they were onto something. Structure and function are related. So they make an adjustment. The person gets up, walks 90 steps from the table, and it goes right back to where it was. That's what
that quickly?
Yeah. And today, those studies have been repeated today, and sometimes they're seeing 8 to 10 steps now before the bone goes back to where it was.
That's crazy. How could that be?
It's because the brain is controlling it. So like I said, there's that chain of command where you got the brain controlling nerves. They're sending messages to the fascia. Fascia are telling the tissue what to do, and the tissue and muscles are moving the bones. So the bone just didn't, a lot of us believe like, oh, I slept funny last night, so my back's out. And what I've found in over 20 years of doing this stuff is that isn't the case. We're going to have to talk about stress and how stress is impacting everything, because what we found in the brain is that we've actually normalized it. And so, one thing in a lot of science, it's kind of like we just take a slice of the population, a mix of folks, and we measure their brain waves. We go, wow, everyone's in beta waves in one hemisphere. I guess that's normal. And so we normalize a stress state. And so their stress isn't just a response to like, oh my gosh, my boss is a jerk, or traffic, I'm so stressed out, or I'm going to be late. There's a whole physiology to stress. And that physiology to stress requires, it's from our primitive hunter-gatherer ancestry. And it's a really beautiful response to an actual threat to our survival. So we go in and protect ourselves and we get through that situation. But what's happening in modern times is that same mechanism that was there to respond to the tiger or the bear is getting flipped on by the traffic or the bills or the boss or the media or the wars and wherever. And instead of having a clear beginning and a clear ending like the primitive stress where there's the bear, I got these options, right? I can try to fight it, I can run from it, I can freeze and play dead. And in 20, 30 minutes, you either died or you made it. And when you made it, your brain goes, okay, bear's gone. And it can come out of that stress physiology and back into your normal neutral mode. And that is alpha waves. And that's when the brain is balanced. Anytime you go into a stress state, the brain lateralizes its function so that it can move the blood flow, glucose, and oxygen to the limbs so that you can access that adrenaline to take on an enemy, or kick in the cortisol because you don't know when the enemy's, it's lurking somewhere, right? But I'm just preparing for battle. And if I'm injured, I can use that cortisol to numb me out a little bit while I'm waiting. So it's that physiology that pulls the same stuff, the oxygen, glucose, and blood flow from the viscera, so from your immune system and digestive system and tissue repair and cell function and replication, all those systems that are essential to healthy, vital living, they get robbed in order for that survival system to kick in. And then you also drop back into a more primitive part of the brain. Like I was saying, there's always a lateralization. So you get like a dimming of one hemisphere. You're operating out of one hemisphere in the back hindbrain. So it's this primitive limbic, prelimbic system where we're seeing the world through the amygdala. And that amygdala only has those few options. It's playing predator-prey games. You may have noticed that, quite a few people out there easily get polarized and easily are playing games with each other instead of being more objective. They're in a subjective reality.
Is it that they're just overly emotional and less balanced, and they're more prone to fly off the handle at situations and stresses, or is it a specific type of unbalancing?
Well, the way I see it is it starts at the top. So like energy comes in, the brain and nervous system, they receive and conduct that energy through the system, through the rest of the body. And so down line of that is the way we connect a part of the brain that you're functioning in that's running the show is linked to a specific type of thinking and emoting. So when in your prefrontal cortex and you're really in that highest human level of function, it's easier to be objective, to see that there's upsides and downsides to everything, to start to connect like why something seems to be more valuable to you because you have specific priorities and things you care about. And so that's what really turns the lens for you and allows you to say, oh, this is what's my choice. And once you're in that limbic or prelimbic system and there's that imbalance, there's you're much more volatile emotions. You got to think about, put yourself into the shoes of a hunter-gatherer who is seeing a tiger, right? So when that part of the brain takes over, the senses become alert to little changes, like there's a quick movement in my field of vision, right? So there's this tension on the optic nerve. The ears are tuned for predator type sounds, and that comes along with certain type of thinking and emoting. So like we're more likely to go off the rails or off the hinges, like you said. We're more likely to have thoughts of like, oh gosh, like gloom and doom thoughts. We go into worry and concern, and then that's the longer we're in that's depression and anxiety. So there's a lot of this like no longer able to be really present. And now we're oriented towards, shit, what's coming down the pipes from the future? When's this creature going to come out of the woods? And then we're using the past to analyze what do we think is the best idea for us right now, instead of being able to actually be present, gather the
Well, I'm saying you have to cultivate patience and attention. It's very hard to do that. Like, I don't use any social media, but I do listen to YouTube videos. I don't usually watch them, but I listen to them sped up, 1.25, 1.5. And I wondered if it makes me more impatient just listening to anybody talk, because they're not sped up,
Yeah. I mean, I think that's really, one, that's pretty brilliant of you, right? To reduce the light and the screen time and get that audio. I do the same thing. I listen to things at 1.5 for the most part, unless someone's a real fast talker. But I imagine that when you're listening to that, could help you cultivate patience for sure.
Well, I've spoken to people that are on TikTok, not through TikTok, but using it. And I say, hey, what do you remember about what you just watched? And they're like, I don't know. They remember nothing of what they just watched. Literally nothing. It's crazy. It's like a waste of time.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting about that and what your point you're making. So, and this is, it depends on how far out, meta view you want to look, but social media companies are if you talk to anybody who's in like a leadership or C-level for these companies, their languaging is literally this, like it's a race to the brainstem, meaning they're trying to figure out how to make their platform hack your brain. And so you're far more susceptible to those hacks if you're in a stress state, because you're already in a very primitive part of the brain. The brainstem is the most primitive. That's our amphibian or pre-amphibian brain. And we don't lose the old parts of the brain. We have them all. And the thing about those older parts is that they're able to move bigger neurons faster. So when we go into a stress state, that part of the brain can override that objective mind that's able to look at all of the information or data or see all sides of a situation, and instead easily triggered into polarization. And you look at those algorithms and they're designed to trigger that, and they're triggering a dopamine response, which is a novelty engine. So it's like, like they watch the video and they're seeing if there's anything in it that's going to kick that dopamine, and then they scroll to the next one and to the next one. And they're not taking in that information, most likely, especially if they're letting all of their senses like hone in on it, because they're looking for the next thing. And it could be anything from I call it the plane of suffering, which is kind of between the things we're afraid of and afraid to gain, or the things that we think we fantasize and infatuate that we think we want, right? Those are the two polarities that are being played out, or we're being played with, when we're stuck in a stress state.
Okay. Is there a self-care protocol at home, or are you pointing this out to people that you work with and then you have specific exercises to help them, or how does it work?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one of the things is we're going to talk about this alpha-biotic alignment. And so that is this guy, Virgil Crane. He discovered that when he was seeing that, man, none of these adjustments are lasting more than 90 steps, it took him 19 years, but he knew he had to figure out how to communicate to the brain. So there's a place on the back of the head on each side of the skull on the outer edge of the occiput, which is in the back of the head. So it's behind the condyle. There's this area, and it happens to be where there's a main nerve ganglion for the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system. So that autonomic nervous system, for your audience, is split into two branches. You got sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic is the go, 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 fight or flight, freeze, outer reactive. We're dealing with life. We're in it more during the day. Parasympathetic is that rest and digest, growth and repair. It's what we're supposed to go into at night. One of the big reasons that stress is the cause of at least 90% of all disease is that stress locks us into sympathetic. And so we don't get those deeper dips into parasympathetic, so the body gets behind. Your body is a brilliant, self-healing, self-regulating organism that's designed to heal itself. And when we're stuck in stress, it gets behind. And so it starts to accumulate waste and processes and get behind. So Virgil Crane spent 19 years trying to figure out, what can I do? How can I get to communicate to the brain to make us like a holistic systems change or a global system effect? And that's when he discovered that stimulating, sending a signal to this hands-on. So this is something you need to find someone who does alpha biotics, but that creates a pattern interrupt. So it interrupts the stress state and it kind of resets you to factory settings, where that night people, we've followed a lot of people with EEG equipment. And so you see that for the first time in a very long time, their brain is able to get down into delta, which is the slowest brain waves, where parasympathetic activity is the highest. And they're able to sustain that parasympathetic activity in deep delta waves for much longer than they had been for years and decades. Then we've got there's different types of breathing. I mean, breathing is a super amazing way to hack the system or make change in the system, because there's a breath for every state. If you've ever been panicked and you notice the way you breathe, or it's easier to see it in someone else. So if you've been with someone who's having a panic attack or something, you'll notice how they're breathing. And it's like, can't get a breath in, right? Because they're just so overwhelmed by what's happening that they're panicking. So just like that, there's a breath for every state. And so if you start to learn, like, well, obviously, like breathing really fast or barely breathing isn't very effective, but you know that having a slow, deep breath, for instance, is, then you can step in and change your breathing and sustain a changed breathing pattern for a period of time, and we'll see changes in your brain. You'll see changes then that then get downloaded into the nervous system because there's new messaging. So that is one way. And then my favorite, in addition to the breathing, is a movement system that actually I'll offer your audience a free workshop in it at the end, but it's specific type of movement that drives the motion to the spine. And there's this thing that a lot of people know, some people don't, is that the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The fastest way to sculpt the brain is through movement. And so, well, if you want to make changes in your...
You mean like ambidextrous movement, or what movement?
Yeah. I mean, any type of movement, you're lighting up different regions of the brain. But when you have movements that cross your midline, so kind of like ambidextrous, right? We're using both arms and you're crossing the midline of your body. What happens is you're forcing the two hemispheres to connect and communicate across the corpus callosum, which is like the chasm between the two hemispheres. So there's all this neuronal activity and electricity firing off across. And so the two hemispheres get to check in. And when you're in a stress state, one is just having a brownout. So there's not a lot of checking in. And just by crossing and connecting those two hemispheres, we see a shift in brainwaves, a slowing down into alpha and theta in both hemispheres. And so muscles that are tight relax, weak ones turn back on. You get a musculoskeletal balancing as well as a brain balancing, and people notice immediate shifts in their perception. So then instead of perceiving the world in sort of that tense, stressed, survival response way, instead they're like, wow, the world got a little brighter. I'm hearing more sounds. There's just a change literally in your physiology because your receptors are all opening back up instead of being constricted for survival.
But how do you do this? Is it just a relaxation technique, or is it chiropractic adjustments, or what is it?
Well, which one? So the alpha biotics is a hands-on thing where you get about a 1/2 inch assisted movement to the back of the head. So if someone places your hand on a very specific location, and with a very specific movement, they're able to send a signal into the brain, into that nerve ganglion. It's like a junction where all the nerves meet up and they come out of the back of the skull. Then for the movement, we call it EDGU, which is EDGU. It's like the edge of you is your spine between the two halves and two halves of the brain. And those are, you can sit and do the movements, you can stand and do the movements, but you're basically gyrating. So you stabilize the hips, whether you're standing or sitting, and you gyrate. So you twist left and twist right, but there's specific arm motions and movements that come along with that, and head movements. So your eyes are also following. So they're crossing that midline as well. And that's how that state change occurs.
I mean, what does this look like? It's just hard to describe by just hearing about it, but what would be an example that you can give?
It kind of like, have you ever seen like a Tibetan prayer wheel or something like that, where it's like a stick and then there's like a barrel, and on the side of the barrel is 2 strings with a ball on the end of it. And so if you take your hands on the stick and you twist up, like you go back and forth, it starts to swing those little strings with the balls back and forth around the sides. That's what you're kind of creating with your arms around your spine. So not only does it create that brain balancing effect, slow the brain waves down, you're also getting this like squeezing out, like a wringing out of a towel, but the spine is wringing out toxins and tight tissue. And so you get a balancing effect, and then it's also strengthening. So there's the tissue around the spine just gets worked. And so over time, you do it regularly, even just a few minutes a day, you start to get a really strong and supple spine, which then allows the brain to communicate to and from the body with far more efficacy.
Okay. What's the name for this protocol? Is it something you made up, or is it taken from someone else?
Yeah, no, it's a lineage that was passed on to me. It's called EDGU, EDGU, Evolutionary Spinal Maintenance. And it was founded by a guy named Jeffery Redman, and he had been thrown out of a car when he was 2 back in the early 50s, 1951 or something like that. So his parents are driving, no seatbelts back then, and he got thrown out, landed on his back, they picked him up. It was an accident, and he seemed okay, brushed him off and moved on. But he went through his childhood and into adulthood with extreme abdominal pain. And so most doctors were trying to treat his stomach and digestion, but it turned out later he tried everything he could because the pain just never stopped. And he was able to get some exploratory surgeries in the 70s and early 80s, and they discovered that where he took that impact, his spine didn't develop correctly. So he had childlike vertebra in his back as an adult. So it was pinching the nerves that led to the digestive organs, and so that's what was creating that pain. And he was kind of like, either I end my life or I find a solution. Pain was so intense. And so through the 80s, he would spend a lot of time hiking outside of Lake Tahoe, just like searching for answers. And he said he would meditate every morning on this cliff right behind his place there where he lived. And he started doing, if you ever seen like a lawn sprinkler that goes back and forth, like, left, he said that was like what he has found his body just naturally doing, was going left and right. And so he started just doing all these arm motions with it. And at some point, he said he woke up and he's like, damn, something's missing. And it was his pain had liberated to a degree where it made a huge difference. And so he's like, what have I been doing? Maybe it's those sprinkler motions. So he sequenced those together and started testing them with other folks and chiropractors and osteopaths to some EEG equipment, and was like, whoa, look what's happening. There's all this change in my brain. There's all this change in my back. Yeah, he started teaching it.
So is it like somatic movement then?
Yeah,
Or is it?
You could kind of like, I would describe it almost like Qigong on the bottom, Tai Chi on the top, but you have straight arms and you stay in a wide open horse stance kind of position, or you can sit like or lean against something so it stabilizes the hips. Because even movements like yoga, most of the time the pelvis moves with the lumbar, so you don't get those vertebrae to actually move on one another, and they really need to move. A lot of times, like I work with a lot of folks and they're, oh, you had a herniated disc, like there's no solution for that, or there's no, you got to get surgery. And it's because most folks are trained that it's like, it is just a one-way street, like aging and degeneration are one way. But when we move and we move correctly, we can actually get those vertebrae to move, and the intervertebral discs that sit between them they have a distributed fluid connection between all the intervertebral discs in the spine. So when you move correctly, you can redistribute that fluid, because most of the time it's like a compression from gravity and from bad posture and not enough movement, or sitting in cars or at desks, etc., that creates that compression, and eventually that disc will blow out. You either, people talk about pinched nerves, and that's all from those disc compressions, or herniations is when the disc actually tears. And
so you have your patients do what, posture therapy and then somatic movements, and that kind of, a regular practice of those two things gets them where they need to go, or what?
Yeah, pretty much. We, with my clients, it's like we do the alphabetic alignment, which resets that brain-body connection. So since the brain, like I said at the beginning, controls nerves, which control fascia, which control muscles, which move bones, if you've got bones that are stuck together, that means you've had massive contracted tissue around that vertebra for a long time. So resetting the connection and then doing movement work and breath work, both, that help to bring energy and movement to the area, and then bring blood flow, glucose, and oxygen. Because in order to repair tissue, you need to have the right type of enzymes to break down the calcifications and the other things the body had set up around those areas of injury. And so you start to break that down and increase movement and mobility and give the body a chance to heal itself. It just happens again and again and again.
Okay. I don't know. Are there any circumstances where you just can't help the person, or does this work so well that it's almost universal?
It's kind of a combination of what I see is like how long they've had it. There's like how long they've been degenerating and stuck in it, and then how much life force they have. So sometimes it's a longer road because they're so degenerated and depleted, and that combination can be just one, like where they're at. They actually, sometimes it's best to do an intervention and then work with them, but that's rare. So it's really about, it's kind of like life force over duration is what the equation looks like. So how much like life force and energy did they have? Or is it like full bedridden, degenerative, and they've been down for a long time? Then it may be a much longer road. And those folks sometimes don't take the road long enough to find out. And who knows if it would have worked or not. but definitely some major ones. And then even some big, people who are top world level Olympic athletes, they incur big injuries and big problems, and I've seen it work for them brilliantly as well. But they, again, have the life force, right? And then even if it's a significant impact or a break or a herniated disc, they can rebuild because they've got life force, and the time that's elapsed since the injury is often within 5 years or something.
Okay. So do people have to be local to you, or can you help them over the internet with, with Zoom and everything?
Totally help them over Zoom. Yeah. And I even teach this edu stuff. We've got an online course so people can just take it at their own pace. It's built in like building blocks. So they get part A and then part B and then part C, and they start stringing it together. What I found is that even just a few minutes of these type of movements every day will have such a profound effect. Like people will come and say, oh, it's because I have this neck thing. But then as they start to do the movements, they're like, well, I didn't tell you is that I have, incontinence, and now I'm sleeping through the night and don't have to wake up to pee. And what I didn't tell you is I had, constant IBS, and that got better. Just things that people typically will come in and have like their pain, especially spinal, and that's the thing that brings them in. But when they start to move, because the way the brain and nervous system affect everything, and the spine is the conduit that all of that moves through, they get benefits that were unexpected. And that's always fun.
Okay.
Yeah. But for the hands-on stuff, I run the Alpha Biotic Training Academy. So I've got classes annually. It's a year-long program, but out of Dallas and California. And so I have a network of people who do this work, at least the hands-on part, so that if they can get to one of those folks and get an autonomic nervous system reset, then they can start to add the movement. And that combination I've found to be fantastic, especially if they just are willing to put in a little effort. It goes a long way.
Okay. Well, excellent. Well, very good. So where can people find out more? What's like their first stop on where they can go?
Yeah, I would say, you can find me and what I'm up to at vitalistproject.com, and that's VITALIST project.com. But if they want to just check out a free workshop and get to know me a little bit more and go deeper into what we talked about today, they can go to haveahappyspine.com. And that is a link to a free workshop. It's about 75 minutes. And in it, not only do I talk about how the brain and stress is affecting us, but then I give you some practical experiences that you can start to use today. Because there's, like I said, it's not rocket science. It's actually just learning to move the body in a specific way, and you can get results in just a few minutes a day.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Well, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.
Oh, it's because I have this neck thing. But then as they start to do the movements, they're like, well, I didn't tell you is that I have, incontinence, and now I'm sleeping through the night and don't have to wake up to pee. And what I didn't tell you is I had, constant IBS, and that got better. Just things that people typically will come in and have like their pain, especially spinal, and that's the thing that brings them in. But when they start to move, because the way the brain and nervous system affect everything, and the spine is the conduit that all of that moves through, they get benefits that were unexpected. And that's always fun.
Okay.
Yeah. But for the hands-on stuff, I run the Alpha Biotic Training Academy. So I've got classes annually. It's a year-long program, but out of Dallas and California. And so I have a network of people who do this work, at least the hands-on part, so that if they can get to one of those folks and get an autonomic nervous system reset, then they can start to add the movement. And that combination I've found to be fantastic, especially if they just are willing to put in a little effort. It goes a long way.
Okay. Well, excellent. Well, very good. So where can people find out more? What's like their first stop on where they can go?
Yeah, I would say, you can find me and what I'm up to at vitalistproject.com, and that's VITALIST project. .com. But if they want to just check out a free workshop and get to know me a little bit more and go deeper into what we talked about today, they can go to haveahappyspine.com. And that is a link to a free workshop. It's about 75 minutes. And in it, not only do I talk about how the brain and stress is affecting us, but then I give you some practical experiences that you can start to use today. Because there's, like I said, it's not rocket science. It's actually just learning to move the body in a specific way, and you can get results in just a few minutes a day.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, very good. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.